It's my pleasure to be here with you on a stormy morning in Tokyo. And as Jasper was saying, I think it's a right setting for a challenging topic that we have today. And I don't want to be referred to as Amenon after this setting. But again, it's a pleasure. And, because I want to have a lot of time with you for your comments and your Q&A, I'll try to keep my remarks on the shorter side. But I'm known that once I get talking, I can go on and on. So, Jasper, I have a watch here in front of me, but do let me know. I have like three main topics that I would like to cover in my initial remarks. And they're basically questions that I would like to explore with all of you this morning. The first one is, why is Trump 2.0 so different from what we saw in trade policy during his first term? There was already a lot that we know about this president and his love of tariffs, but still there are a lot of surprises for many of us. So what has happened since? The second question is, I think that for everyone who's trying to provide analysis of what's going on in the trade world over the past 6 months, there's so much action, there's so much confusion, there's a fog of, all this turbulence, if you will, that I think it's important to step back from the blow by blow and provide, I think, some analysis, some takeaways of what we can make of some important developments. And I would like to make some comments on what we saw happen between the United States and China, because there are lessons to be learned there, but also then focus on the negotiations with Japan. And then lastly, what does this all mean for Japan, and what should Japan do in light of what is happening to the U.S. Trade policy and the implications for the trading system? So I'm being ambitious, trying to cover a lot. I'll try to be a little bit telegraphic on some of these topics, and then welcome the conversation with Jasper and your questions. So the first question, of course, is why is President Trump actions in his second term when it comes to trade so different from what we saw in the first term? And I think this is an interesting question because President Trump's views on trade actually had been fixed for a very long time. They go back decades, and many of them were formed by looking at Japan in the 1980s. And the ideas are well known, and that is that the trade balance basically takes measure of how much cheating is taking place by the trade counterpart. That if the U.S. runs a trade deficit with someone, with another country, is because there is some cheating going on. And the second basic idea is that the way to correct this is with a tariff. So the tariff stops the cheating, and the tariff also generates revenue from the president's point of view, and therefore is a way to increase prosperity. So I'm not breaking news here. These are views that have been in his mind for a very long time. But nevertheless, the first 6 months, it's only 6 months since inauguration, we see that the tariff actions are now at unprecedented level. There is a 10% global tariff now in effect. We have now a number of sectoral tariffs, very hefty tariffs on metals, 50% on aluminum and steel, and now more recently copper. You have the 25% tariff on automobiles, and then you have the so-called, and I do, when I write, I use quotation marks, so I'm speaking the so-called reciprocal tariffs, which are very hefty tariffs applied to scores of countries that really have shaken everyone up. And this means that the levels of protectionism that we see now from the United States have not been seen in over a century. It's very new territory, just the sheer amount of tariffs. Some of them have been paused, we know, but nevertheless, there's new, these are very significant developments. And if I try to explain to myself, I'll share a little bit of my thought process as to why this time is so different. I think that there are two main factors here, and both of them are important. One is that the usual checks and balances on the executives' trade decision-making have basically been pushed aside. And I think that we're going through in the U.S. at this moment is a moment of, it's not just about trade, but it's a moment of unbound presidential authority. And I think that therefore, the president has a lot of free rein to decide the tariffs. And why is this the case? Well, there are three branches of government in the United States. But, over time, Congress, which by Article 1 of the Constitution does have the authority to regulate commerce, over the years Congress has abdicated or has delegated this authority to the executive. And for many years now, what we've seen is that the U.S. has pursued trade agreements not by Congress setting the parameters of the negotiation and voting on trade agreements, but actually by the executive going forward with executive orders. This is not new to President Trump, but I think that President Trump has taken this even further. And we see that in this current Republican Congress, there's even a greater delegation of authority over the power of the purse, over the power to tax foreign commerce. And as long as this continues, Congress is not going to really be a strong restraint on presidential authority to set the tariffs. And we also have another branch of government in the United States, which are the courts. And this could also be a source for reining in the president. But so far, that has not happened. For the trade nerds like me, there was an interesting surprise in late May when there were two rulings, one by the International Trade Court, another by a district, Washington, D.C. court, basically saying that the tariffs that President Trump has implemented, the so-called reciprocal tariffs, are illegal or do not conform with the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is the authority that the president has invoked to impose these broad tariffs. And instead of going to all the legal arguments, I'm happy to do that, the basic argument is that the president has overstepped the authority and that the tariffs therefore should be brought down. Now, an appeal was filed immediately, and while that appeal is being heard, the tariffs are still can go forward, and it's very likely that this will make its way up to the Supreme Court. And again, given the actions of the Supreme Court on many fronts in recent months, I'm not optimistic that the Supreme Court will choose to rein in the president, especially because the president is citing national security as the justification for its tariffs, and usually courts have been very deferential. And even if the court were to rule against the Trump administration on this, there are other trade authorities, legal authorities that this administration could use. They will not be as flexible, but there's plenty in the toolkit if you really want to go for a tariff that could be implemented. Now, the institutions, therefore, have not restrained the president, but I think that there are two other important factors that could, over time, come to exert some restraint on the executive, and that is, of course, the markets and voters. And we saw already a very interesting reaction on April 2nd when the reciprocal tariffs were first announced from the markets. And my hunch is that that is largely what also motivated the Trump administration to call for a pause and to say we're trying to reach negotiated deals. So how markets react to these important change in trade policy is going to be an important factor to keep an eye on, especially now that we have the August 1st deadline, but also I think voters. And, there's going to be a midterm in next year in the fall. And we know that the tariffs so far have not been very popular, that inflation has not yet increased, but if it does, we need to see how this plays with the American voter. But I think that those may be the elements where we can see perhaps some more pushback on the current trade agenda, but because otherwise it's really a free, it's a green light when you think about what other institutions are doing. Which then brings me to the second question or the second element of why President Trump seems to be doing so much more with the tariffs. And I think here we get to a deceptively simple but very complex question that I get asked all the time. What is the president trying to achieve? Why these very rapid increase in tariffs? And, it's not so easy to answer because there are many things that the president is trying to achieve, and they have been mentioned many times, that he's trying to correct for the trade deficit, that he's trying to engineer a renewal of U.S. manufacturing, that he's also interested in the revenue collection, something that we think more of a 19th century goal, but now it seems to be very present for this president. And all of those are, of course, important motivations. There are contradictions in pursuing these goals. But rather than rehash what you probably have already heard many times, what I would like to do is to abstract and think about what I really think is more fundamental in terms of what is driving this president, and that really speak to a reset or really intensification of important developments, but now taken to an entirely new level. And I would highlight three important drivers for the second administration of President Trump when it comes to trade policy. One is that I think we have not seen tariffs being used as a form of sanction, as a form of coercive leverage in the way in which we're now seeing them utilized. You know, the first tariffs that President Trump applied were pursued not for economic objectives, not trade objectives. They were pursued regarding shipments of fentanyl and immigration. And we also have seen now the president take this to a new level with the newest announcement on tariffs against Brazil that have to do with nothing about trade, but with, you know, a domestic judicial process regarding former President Bolsonaro. So the way in which I think the president is thinking about tariffs is purely as sticks when he's thinking about these non-economic objectives. And then you're basically discussing what size is the stick going to be, and that's when you get the 25 or the 50% tariff level. And that actually has been something quite new to watch. The second, I think, major driver, this is not new to the President Trump's second term, but I think it has now reached a new level, and it's going to have very profound implications. And that is, you know, as a trade scholar for many years, what I've been very worried about and I see materializing is the abuse of the national security card. And clearly we live in a turbulent world. That's why I chose that title. And clearly there are good reasons to be concerned about the weaponization of economic interdependence. And that's why we see many countries, including Japan, but many others, develop this economic security toolkit. So there's good reasons to do this. But every time a government is going to use a national security threat or a national security interest to regulate international economic transactions, we want them to be judicious in the way in which they proceed, and we want them to identify genuine security interest. Because otherwise, I think, the concern is that this can give you know, an opportunity for more protectionist moves. And I think that that's my biggest concern when I see now what the Trump administration is doing. And I think that, again, the United States has been invoking the national security argument for a while, but President Trump took it to a new level on the day of his inauguration. One of his first executive orders was about America First trade policy. And to me, you know, there was a lot there, but to me, the most important idea there was that there was a complete, you know, equivalence saying that, you know, a trade deficit is a national security threat. Nobody had really elevated a trade deficit as such as a national security threat. And that then gives an opportunity for imposing all kinds of restrictive measures if you already have made the trade balance a national security threat. And that's why we saw the invocation of IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. And that's a whole mouthful to say. And lastly, the third other, I think, major driver that we should keep an eye on, because it does speak about it's a broader objective, and it's a much fundamental reset that we should not that we should keep an eye on, is that the argument that tariffs are central to U.S. leadership. And therefore, what is being proposed is an entirely different way to think about burden sharing. And to me, the easiest or to follow articulation came in a speech given by the chair of the Council for Economic Advisors, Mr. Stephen Miran, at a Washington think tank. It wasn't Brookings, but it was this spring, talking about the administration's foreign economic policy. And you know, it's a very interesting speech because basically the argument is that the United States for 70, almost 80 years now, has been providing public goods to the world. What are these public goods? Well, the security umbrella and the dollar as a stable reserve currency. And that the United States has been providing these public goods at great cost and as a sacrifice, not as deriving enormous benefits from that display of leadership. And therefore, that it's time now for other countries to benefit from this architecture to be paying back. And, there is even an enumeration on the ways in which other countries can now pay back the United States for providing these public goods. For example, by investing in the United States, by paying the higher tariffs without retaliating, by buying more from the United States, both in general, but also defense materials, or quite simply, and this does come up in the speech, by sending checks to the U.S. Treasury. But in general, the overall sentiment and thinking that the U.S. has stretched itself in providing these goods, and now there must be some reimbursement, I think is also an important driver of the trade objectives of the Trump administration. Now, very quickly, because I do want to get to Japan, and I spend a lot of my time on the motivations, we saw a trade war and a trade truce with China in just a few months. There's a lot to take from that. I have more comments to make because now I want to shift to Japan, but just to say that, I think that it was a really, there have been a couple of scary moments for me, Jesper, in the past few months. One was April 2nd, market reaction, the bond sell-off, that to me was a little bit scary. That was a very uncertain moment. Second, a scary period for me was when there was really a game of chicken played out by the United States and China with a tit-for-tat rapid escalation. Like in a week or 10 days, we went to a tariff that was 125% each way. Both parties were going to apply that kind of tariff. That's an embargo level tariff. At that level, trade is simply not very profitable. And we saw a drop on cargo ships being scheduled, booked. And I thought that was a very scary moment. I think that the governments of the United States and China also thought that. And then we saw a movement towards de-escalation. And I'm happy to talk about the escalation, de-escalation, and the so-called deal, which to me is mostly a truce of sorts and a very fragile one. But because I do want to spend a lot of time of what I have left, another 10 minutes or so, talking about...
Keep going.
Okay, so with your permission then I can always go back to U.S. China. So then I'll spend my time talking about the U.S.-Japan situation. And again, this is another one where our early expectations have not panned out, right? And we keep being confused because assumptions we had have been pushed by the wayside. And I think that the first assumption was that the U.S. and Japan have such strong, robust relationship, and that the first Ishiba Trump meeting, which took place in Washington in February, had gone so well that perhaps it would be relatively smooth sailing. I mean, relatively because we know that they're choppy winds, but nevertheless, that if there was one country that had made itself, extremely important to the United States and Japan, that there's a lot of history behind these two countries in negotiating trade, and that it was relatively easy to think about what kind of package deal would be enough, perhaps, to accomplish at least an initial trade agreement. And those expectations have certainly not played out. And what we saw is that instead we had negotiation a stalemate. Mr. Akazawa, the chief negotiator of Japan, I think has been to the United States 7 times in almost as many weeks. I almost think that maybe he should have just an outpost in Washington, and I know he needs to come back and do the consultations here. But nevertheless, it's a very punishing schedule for him. I also take note that it's like shuttle diplomacy, but only one team travels. And I think that also tells you a little bit about the negotiation dynamics. And nevertheless, despite the 7 trips and constant talks between the United States and Japan, we are not yet within an agreement. Instead, Japan has gotten a letter, and Japan has been notified that the tariff now is to be 25% by August 1st. And again, why? Why the stalemate? Why our expectations never seem to, or at least my expectations never seem to pan out? And, I think that 2 main reasons for this is, first of all, a mismatch in the expectations as to what is to be negotiated. I don't think the 2 sides have approached the negotiations with an understanding of what is the scope of the talks. And the second factor is also, of course, Japan's electoral calendar. because domestic politics matter, especially for trade negotiations. So what is this mismatch? Well, quite simply that Japan, and as a principle, I agree with this position, but as a negotiation strategy, it creates its complications. But Japan has insisted that all the tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed this year, that is the global tariff, the sectoral tariffs, particularly when it comes to automobiles, and the reciprocal tariff, that all those tariffs should be negotiated away, that the objective for Japan is to bring us back to to January 20th, if you will, in terms of the tariffs that the United States applies on Japan. Whereas the U.S. position has been that the negotiations are really just about the reciprocal tariffs, and that the auto tariffs, because they have been imposed by invoking that national security consideration, are off limits, and that the global tariff is also off limits, because the United States now believes that it's to its interest to have this revenue collection operation. So I think this has created an impossible situation because, any deal that, excludes auto tariffs for Japan is a win-lose deal, with Japan on the losing end. And it's not possible, I think, to sell it back to your public. So, I believe that also the mismatched expectation is that the U.S. is not operating as if it understands that other countries have domestic politics too. And especially this is the case when there is an important upper house election around the corner. So very difficult at any point in time for Japan to agree to a trade deal that has nothing on autos, but certainly very difficult to do that. And that, I think, is Japan's really bad luck, that the July 9 and the July 20th deadlines, or now the August 1st, they have all landed at the same time. That creates also very little leeway for the Ishiba administration, which brings me to the other sensitive issue, of course, which is rice. And President Trump, as I said, his ideas come from the 80s, and I think he has reverted thinking about Japan, the U.S. in the 80s, and in that time, it's autos and rice, and his comments have been about all those issues. And, to me, it's a great irony. I feel like a little bit tired because I've been spent decades working on this, and we're back to autos and rice. We don't seem to be able to step away from that. But
we solved the beef issue. The stomachs have gotten bigger.
But again, very difficult for the prime minister on the eve of a, really challenging election to do anything really meaningful on rice. And the question is, what happens after the election? But so that's why I think that, it has been difficult for the two sides to bridge those differences. There are other difficulties, the fact that just getting a hold of the U.S. Cabinet level negotiators is challenging. You're competing for face time because they're negotiating with scores of countries. We've never had really anything like this before. But, we need to see what happens. But I do see this as a moment of peril. And I'm really, I don't like to use that word, but I'm really worried about where we're at now in terms of the trade negotiations and implications. Because, if no deal can be closed in the near term, I think that the economic fallout will be very serious for Japan, particularly. I mean, the U.S. is also going to go through something because of all these developments on immigration, trade, the budget deficit, and so forth. But for Japan, we know that given the importance of the U.S. market, particularly, let's say, for automobile exports, this could be a real strong shock or bad news economically. When the April 2nd tariffs were first announced, there were some estimates done that talked about a reduction of 0.8% in Japanese GDP. Paul Krugman had a statistic that, talked about if a 25% tariff on Japan and Korea were to stay on, a major, major cut in trans-Pacific trade. And, the economists will come up with all kinds of estimates, but there's certainly not good news to be derived from a 25 across-the-board tariff for U.S.-Japan trade. But even if the deal is struck, and that's why I'm a little more worried, the tariffs are not going away. And we need to be very clear-eyed about that. Because that percent tariff, to me, seems innumerable. I don't see the United States at this point really taking that back. Because as I said before, President Trump has very big goals when it comes to tariffs, and he's going to be, calling for tariffs that affect Japan directly, but affect Japan indirectly as well, because of Japanese investments around the world. So what happens to Mexico, Canada trade also affect Japanese companies. So we need to understand that this is compounded effect because of the way the tariffs operate. And these tariffs, therefore, we're not going to a clean slate anytime soon, or certainly the status quo as ante seems almost impossible to go back to. And lastly, also on this point, because President Trump, I would venture to say, wants to refresh the deal. Let me put it that way. And because he has made the yardstick, the trade deficit, we know that whatever Japan puts on the paper for a deal is not going to wipe out the trade deficit, because that's not the root cause of the trade deficit. So as long as the trade deficit persists, President Trump will be coming back to Japan and say, it's still there. What are you going to be doing for me now? So this is a moving target. We know that because Trump negotiated a deal with Japan in 2019, and here we are today talking about new tariffs. And I also I think it's a moment, a difficult moment, because whether there's a deal or no deal, especially no deal scenario, but even if there is, a significant loss of trust has already taken place. And again, here, if you hear what Prime Minister Ishiba is saying about the negotiations, he's highlighting that Japan should be treated differently. That Japan makes enormous contributions to the U.S. economy because it's the largest investor. That Japan is the indispensable ally of the United States in the Indo-Pacific. That when you think about what the U.S. wants to accomplish on economic security vis-a-vis China, you have to have Japan on board with that. And therefore that the Prime Minister, I think correctly, is saying we have a special partnership, and that should be reflected in the negotiations. And I think that the rude awakening we're coming here in Tokyo is that President Trump is not thinking about special partnerships. He's thinking about trade deficits. And the numbers are don't highlight special bonds. And I think that's why Japan has gotten a letter just like everyone else. And I think that was a particularly pain point for Tokyo, that Japan was grouped with everybody and that there was no further consideration. And lastly, why I'm worried is because, well, we relitigate these old themes in the U.S.-Japan relationship, well, we have this erosion of trust, then there are opportunity costs of not thinking, as we were until more recently, about how to move really all in on the economic security front to deal with, say, overcapacity issues from China, overdependence on China. It becomes difficult or harder to do so. So if I have 5 more minutes, I can go into a little bit of what I think Japan should do. And these are, of course, very half-baked ideas, and I welcome your comments. But, I think that Japan has ahead for itself a really, really tough balancing act. And it's going to be a balancing act between alliance management and diversification. And you need to do both. And, when I think about alliance management, a lot of what I think Japan and other allies are grappling with is a fear of, it's an old dilemma in alliance dynamics, a fear of abandonment, a fear that the United States may turn inward, and therefore it's important to keep the United States engaged and to keep, that strong security bond, that strong economic connection. And that's why I think it's really important for Japan to find a way to a deal. Because as long as that deal proves elusive, I think it's going to be hard to really, calm the waters in the U.S.-Japan relationship, particularly because my take is that President Trump, a lot of what the MAGA movement is America first, and that's very, very strong motivation. But a lot of how I understand things is it's also very much an economics first approach from the Trump administration. So when President Trump thinks about particular relationships, particular security issues, even hardcore security issues, they're usually measured through a lens of the economic benefit to be had. And I think this was very clear, say, in Ukraine, when even his advisors were trying to get the president to be more committed to the defense of Ukraine. And they were advising the Ukrainians, go for that critical minerals deal, because that's a way in which the president will feel vested in the relationship. So that's why I think that for the overall U.S.-Japan relationship, eliminating trade friction is always important. But for this president in particular, who uses the economic benefit yardstick first, I think it's very important to make sure that that's not an irritant. Now, I am not going to make predictions of what's the final package. I wish I was a fly in the room of those phone calls and those conversations, but I'm not private to them. So I'm not sure what the landing zones are, but I do believe that Japan needs to be able to have some kind of win, whether it's a tariff rate quota like the UK got. I think that, I know that Prime Minister Shiba at the time said that the UK deal is not the model for Japan. I actually think that in hindsight, perhaps any flexibility that the US could show on the auto tariff, I think would be very good and a good grab if it's there to be had. But I'm not sure if that is the case. But in any case, what I'm trying to get at is that President Trump is not going to compartmentalize the security and the trade issues as much as Tokyo would like it to be the case. And that's why these trade talk stakes are very high. And that's why I think that the upper house election is so critical. Because, whether Prime Minister Ishiba comes out of those elections with a stronger or weaker hand, or, I'm here to, get the sentiment in the room about where the upper house election might go. But if it's a very poor showing of the LDP and the Prime Minister were to resign, that would, I think, not be the right setup, obviously, to find a way to close a very difficult deal and sell it back home. So this is, again, where the domestic and the trade negotiations are going to be joined at the hip. And my last comment is that Japan cannot be tackling the current really profound moment that we're going through with a bilateral focus. That should not be Japan's only exclusive concern. I think that would be a mistake. And I think that what Japan should be doing is to, again, Japan already has a lot of chops. Japan rescued the TPP. It's time to think big again. And obviously the upper house election will be a factor there too. But I've been writing recently that Japan should relaunch the comprehensive and progressive TPP in a way in which should, I think, bring new partners. And in particular, I think that it's to cultivate potential, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but a potential EU membership or EU dialogue or some kind of connection there is important. I know that, an EU accession to the TPP is hard. Believe me, there's no trade negotiation that is easy. And we know that there are differences in the EU approach to the regulation of digital flows. We know that in the European Union, there's no appetite for investor-state dispute settlement, which is something that's included in the TPP. And we know that the ratification process in the EU of trade agreements is not easy. But I think the time has come to think big, because we are really facing a momentous moment. And the thing to understand, I believe, is that Trump 2.0 trade policy, the consequences for the international trade system are monumental. Because when President Trump, his first term, decided to step away from the TPP, that meant that the U.S. was not willing to pursue further trade liberalization. But the United States at that point was not building huge tariff walls around it. And that's where we are now. And the United States was not, by going for these reciprocal unilateral tariffs, what the U.S. has done de facto is to abdicate or to defect from the multilateral trading system, because it's no longer operating under principles of most favored nation, because it's no longer abiding by the rules. And therefore, this is a new moment. And I think that it's a moment of, I think the European Union president just recently made comments saying that the EU is going to look at CPTPP. There are some very interesting ideas by scholars about what could be done in the meantime. There's an idea particularly I found very compelling about a standstill, So, of course, talking about marriage right away, very hard. Let's talk about dating, if you will. And one way to do that is you agree to a standstill agreement. And what this means is that the 39, so to speak, the 12 of the TPP, now that the UK is there, and the EU members agree not to go protectionist against each other. So to keep the tariffs where they are. Because the concern is that the unilateral tariffs become the new norm. And to agree with that, I think already would be something very meaningful. And then you could have more concrete, specific dialogues on supply chain resilience and see what you can build from there. So, on a stormy morning in Tokyo, I'm telling you, it's a time where there's a lot of destruction going on the established relationships or international trading order. It's a time to be creative and think about construction. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Mireya. There's a lot here to unpack. Maybe we should bring out some champagne or some sake to sort of shed some light on the things here. I wanted, to sort of start the discussion. Another way of, when I've dealt a little bit with Akazawa-san and with Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary. And the one thing that's very clear from the United States side, it's sovereign to sovereign. They loathe anything multilateral. And, I think that Japan deserves quite a bit of credit for actually standing up, right? For standing up, because the big grudge against at one level, the big grudge is that, fine, we'll have a trade agreement, but this is just simply not enforceable and not credible. Like today, we negotiate from 25% to 13%, but tomorrow, Japan does something that catches the president's, irk, and, the tariffs are revved up. There's no governance. There's no covenant around this. What are your views on this? Because, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, you've made a super career out of looking at the establishment of the governance and the covenants around global trade policy, who enforces, what is a claim, who verifies the claim, et cetera, et cetera. This is all being thrown out of the window.
Yes, I mean, that's a key difficulty that, there's a huge credibility problem because whatever you negotiate with the Trump administration is going to buy you a moment of calm, but cannot guarantee you that now you have rules, institution, predictability. And I think that that's why what you get, what you're after is deal after deal. And, USMCA, U.S. Chorus FTA, Japan-U.S. FTA, WTO, those are all, rules that the U.S. agreed to abide by that are not being respected today. And add to that, Jesper, just as an aside, I never really had a moment in my, I'm getting older, but in my long career where I'm about to speak about tariffs and say I'm at the table before coming into the stage. And then I look at my phone and the tariff news have changed.
Right.
So they change in a half day. And it's very difficult to make anything out of it because, say, the UK, who also agreed to negotiate, they have a framework agreement, then the steel tariffs go up, and then, what you negotiated is not exactly what you get at the end because he can change the terms even though the deal has been brokered. So I'll just say this. I think that, I do give a lot of credence to Japan for, sticking by the rules. And that's also going to be important when Japan comes away from this trade agreement. That is not a trade agreement that ends up undermining further the WTO. Japan has a double responsibility. It's a big burden. Mm-hmm. Whatever they agree to negotiate with the United States cannot be blatantly destructive of WTO because Japan, as I said, has a very strong interest in making sure that those old rules don't go away. And what we're really now dealing with is the lack of predictability. Now, other countries have reached their deals, and I know that the question is, should Japan be more flexible and gotten a deal and not a letter? As I was telling Philip just before coming here to the table, is that we all need to grade on a curve. because even when you look at the countries, and first of all, they told us 90 deals in 90 days. We're nowhere near that. I think there are two deals. And when there's the China truce that I'm happy to talk about, but
It's 40 in Indonesia and Vietnam.
See, well, but many of the texts have not been released, and therefore we don't know what the terms are. But those deals are framework deals, with the actual details still to be hammered out through subsequent negotiations. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the U.S. is also going to, it's not only our trade partners who suffer from not having the predictability, the U.S. also is going to suffer from not being able to provide that predictability to companies to invest in the U.S.
No, I mean, this is the big point. I mean, when I make presentations to CEOs of large manufacturing companies now, it's like, fine. They actually don't care, whether it's 10% or 25%. You talk to Toyota doesn't, 25% is nothing. I mean, I've got Naibu, I've got plenty of reserves, right, to deal with the whole thing. But I need a course of action because I need to deploy strategic assets. And this is not an investment in a financial asset. This is where do I produce my machines or whatever it is on the global map over the next 5 to 10 years. That's the predictability that has actually gone out. That's I think the big issue. And the broader issue, in my personal opinion, you talk about the loss of trust, right, is, America democratizing Japan, introducing proper governance where there is checks and balances. That's what the last 70 years have been all about. And now that style of governance, no, the king is better. And that's, I think, where you've got real fundamental issues. Now, talk to me a little bit about China. Right, because the one thing, as you know, in the UK piece of paper, there's this little clause that America reserves the right that should the UK conduct activities with the People's Republic of China, America reserves the right to bring out a whip and punish the UK. Talk to me a little bit about US-China.
Sure. No, and I agree. I also took note of that section of the UK-US trade deal, and that's going to be an issue for every trade deal that the US signs. Because the language there was something like, for these benefits that we're willing to extend to the UK must reassure us of the security of the supply chain and how they get to define the security of the supply chain, how much they may ask, for Chinese content to be phased out. Those are minefields, and, those are important issues that still need to be hammered, and particularly for countries that have a very robust trading relationship with China. Now, a little bit about the U.S.-China dynamics. As I said, I think that we got into that incredibly high level of tariffs, and I believe that it became clear, two things became clear, that nobody wants to decouple, not yet. And that very high level of tariff, it was like they were looking at the precipice and they decided not to jump. Because, it's incredibly costly for these economies to have this abrupt disruption to their economies. So that then brought the de-escalation dynamics. Now, the other, I think, important factor to me, what's interesting, following both trade and economic security issues, is how in this bout, this new instance of a U.S.-China trade war, the tariffs and the export controls were now joined at the hip from the beginning. And what I mean by this is that once the United States began to increase tariffs vis-à-vis China, Beijing retaliated with its export controls on 7 important rare earths that immediately put many American but also other companies' operations at risk. And then the United States, then they had this Geneva meeting where they all certainly came out saying, we have a deal, and that deal proved to be no deal because there was no trust between them, and immediately they each other began to squeeze harder. China never really brought back loosened those export controls, and the United States imposed export controls on aerospace and other items, and also threatened to take into a new direction by threatening to curtail or stop student visas. So we see a spillover effect on many potential elements of the relationship. Finally, you get to the London meeting, because it's clearly that things are looking pretty dire if you continue without being able to bring things to a more functional place. And, I think that now we see that both sides, what they have agreed to do in this so-called deal is just basically put a standstill on the retaliatory measures that they have been implementing over the past few months. There's nothing more than that. So and again, we don't have the text, and it is also talk about governance. Lack of transparency is a huge problem. That we're told that they have a deal, but we don't know what exactly is in there. So that's going to continue. And I had another point, but I lost my train of thought just now about the U.S. China. Well, I'll leave it at that.
They don't know where China is. Sorry.
Yeah. And I remember now. So the bigger issue, President Trump talks about a rebalancing. So the big deal, the big agreement that would really touch on structural issues, such as overcapacity, such as, intellectual property theft, such as state-owned enterprises and subsidization, all those things, we're nowhere near in addressing them. And color me skeptical that President Xi wants to go there. And I think that very, very possibly we just end up with these truths. And now we have these August 1st deadline. So everything is coming crashing down August 1st.
Let me ask you a pointed question. I mean, Japan is the good guy, standing up for multilateralism, all the good stuff we've built over the last 50, 60, 70 years. Could China take over?
No, well, I mean, China could take over, but it will be a different regime.
No, but so the leadership it's all about America first, and there is this wonderful assumption that in a global economy that is $100 trillion, give or take, America is 30, China 20, and everybody else is 4.5 at best in terms of. So America can do it by itself. Right? But rallying, the only way that you can win this, or one way that you could possibly win this, is by brute force, everybody else ganging up against the United States. And who is that focal point? Japan is too soft in its touch to actually present an alliance of the willing. Could China rally the rest of the world against America?
I don't think so, because China also has its many issues. China, the way I describe it is, likes to speak the language of globalization, but doesn't always practice it. And, China's industrial policy model, has its aspirations about self-resilience and making everything go through Beijing. So there are also questions about, China's also bringing overcapacity burdens on others. So add to that the instances of economic coercion, and I think that Chinese leadership becomes very, very problematic for many quite rapidly. I think, maybe I'm more old-fashioned, but I think that now you have the two great powers both using market power to get their way, and it's probably incumbent on smaller players. It's going to be a more labor-intensive process, but nevertheless to think about how you make sure that we don't go to a system where there are no rules, when you cannot know what the tariff is going to be like tomorrow, because everyone loses, I think, in that system in pretty dramatic ways.
Thank you. My name is Takehiro from Sophia University. My question is about negotiating dynamics. It's because of 7 trips to the United States from Japanese diplomats talking about this will not work. So from now on, should Japan invest more on personal cultivating relationship with him, President Trump? Or should we switching to focusing on our economic benefit based on Japanese national interest? Which way should we focus on more after the election, especially? Thank you.
Well, I think that we also need to see what happens at the election, because you need a strong leader to be, being able to negotiate with President Trump. So that's why I think that, to me, the foreign policy stakes of this election are significant. I think that, in terms of the negotiation dynamics, President Trump, he doesn't delegate much. At the end of the day, yes, you're going to have Akazawa-san talking to Mr. Bessent, Mr. Lutnick, and Mr. Greer, and they'll do that consultation. But they themselves say everything goes to President Trump. He doesn't believe in the traditional interagency process. And if you have that in mind, I think what you need, quite frankly, is you cannot go to him with details because he's not going to appreciate that. You have to give him something that he thinks is a big win and that he can, brag about. So, I know, for example, that Prime Minister Ishiba has talked about all the investment that Japanese companies are already making. Well, it has to be some very concrete new major investment that happens under his watch, or a big purchase, or something that makes him able to make the win. But Japan should always do this, obviously looking after its own interest and making sure that the terms of the deal are beneficial. So that's, I think, where things might, that back and forth of what is dual or not is going to be important.
Two quick comments on there. There was a wonderful little anecdote, and I don't think, well, it's not spilling beans, but in the early days of the negotiations, there was somebody from METI, who had clearly spent 3 nights, sort of working on this, and he produced this sliding scale, right, where for every 1,000 jobs that Japanese create in the United States, the tariffs would be going down by 1.85 percentage points, which like incredible PowerPoint slides justifying the whole thing, which is awesome, and thank you. You clearly went to Todai, but this is not, the way to your point, to get anybody's attention, not even Scots, for all intents and purposes. And the second point I would make is, the idea that you have a Trump whisperer, right, who is somehow going to persuade the guy, is unbelievably naive. This guy respects one thing and one thing only, which is brute power. Do you actually have a solid majority to run the country? And this is where it gets interesting, in terms of the dynamics that's playing out here. I mean, we'll see what will happen on Sunday, but the likelihood of a Weimar type situation, right, where you've got fragmented and fractures and all sorts of possibilities for coalition building, right? But at the end of the day, you're not going to have a strong leader. Right? That's, I think, something that's very, very clear. And then one final point, I think, where the Germans, for example, despite having a relatively weak government, right, the Germans were able to come up immediately with the break in the in fiscal policy, right, that you are actually capable and willing and to commit to a doubling, a trebling, and now it's like a quintupling, right, of defense spending, which of course is going to be a major boom for the United States, given that even for Germany defense industry, about 80% of all the kit, of all the stuff, is actually made by America. Right? So this is a transactional deal that you could show right away, and that sort of transactional deal for Japan is going to be very, very difficult.
Thank you very much for the. It's great to hear a stout defense of CPTPP in that way. I completely agree. But I want to ask you about China and CPTPP.
Yes.
You talked about the EU, which is a good idea too. But China would be the great prize if China could be brought into CPTPP. But what I see is, one, people seem to be frozen with fear of doing anything to upset the United States. So the current CPTPP membership, including Japan, seem to be mute on the subject. And secondly, of course, there are poison pills. You mentioned the UK, US one. There's also a USMCA where Canada and Mexico have poison pills as well. So what prospect at all do you see of getting China and Taiwan into CPTPP?
Thank you for that question. I think that obviously bringing an economy the size of China into the CPTPP would expand the scope, but It really all depends on under what terms. And I have not seen China move in a direction that gives me confidence that China would abide by the high standards of the CPTPP. I think, if anything, Chinese state intervention model has intensified. You see greater control from the Communist Party over economic activity. You see more focused industrial policy and massive amounts of subsidies. And of course, everybody now practices industrial policy, even the United States and Japan and so forth. But when you compare the sheer scale of subsidization, China's in a league of its own. So I myself have qualms about bringing China into the CPTPP. I think it could end up transforming to the CPTPP into something that it's not, and something that I think there is hope that if it remains what it is today, the aspirations it has today. Now, I don't believe in excluding China, and I think that Japan has very strong economic interest, but Japan has found a way, I think, to have a cake and eat it too, in the sense that, CPTPP has these very specific standards on state-owned enterprises and all of that. But the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is also an important trade agreement, that's where Japan now has found an opportunity to deepen trade relations with China. So to me, that seems to be a way to go forward. In a more, power analysis based, I would say that Japan also probably should be a little bit reluctant to bring in China to the CPTPP because it's obviously the largest economy right now, and to bring in an economy as powerful as China, but also a government that practices economic coercion, where there is all these frictions, Chinese flying risky, reckless practices lately. I think that there are the broader considerations also as to whether it's better to stay with this two-stage approach to trade, where you provide some market opening and predictability through the RCEP, but you maintain the CPTPP as the standard, the crown jewel of where you think the model of governance should be, one where China is not prepared to be at this moment. And also keeping in mind that if China were to come in, China decides where the TPP goes forward. And obviously Taiwanese membership, not that there's a great prospect now, but we know it will be impossible because China even today is telling others not to support Taiwanese membership. And I'm not expecting the U.S. to go back to CPTPP, but bringing China to CPTPP would obviously send a very, very troublesome message to the United States. So I see a lot of downsides, and I don't think that that should be the way in which Japan thinks about enlargement, especially because Japan also has made economic coercion, the commitment not to engage in economic coercion, an important requirement of joining the TPP. And now, of course, that applies to the U.S. too.
You talk about everything crashing down on August 1st, and yet you look at the US stock market and it's flying in the face of it. And I think largely because of the so-called taco trade, Trump always chickens out. What do you think about, firstly, it's an assumption to make, what do you think about the validity of it? And does Japan's sort of negotiating strategy standing up to the US, will that be vindicated by taco?
Thank you. I wish they wouldn't be telling this to Trump's face, the taco thing, because it's why make him, dig on his heels because he needs to, defend his ego. So in general, I think, if he wants to be flexible and step away from a very destructive action, let him. Don't goad him to stay on. But, it is true. And I when I agreed to give this talk, I thought, by July 16, we'll know. At least we'll have more information, right? But clearly he keeps pushing, punting the deadline, because that's what happened with that letter, is that, the tariffs were supposed to enter into effect in July 9, and now it's August 1st. And especially because everything now is coinciding, converging, that China and also all these talks with August 1st, even it could be a troublesome day if there's a strong market reaction. Now, I don't do finance. That's above my pay grade. So maybe Jesper has other views. But I think that the market, from my point of view, has discounted a little too much the Trump risk. It is true that he backtracks, but please let's not lose sight that in a really hefty amount of tariffs are now being implemented, even if he is backing away from something. A 10% global tariff, let's remember what the Nixon shock was, and it only lasted 4 months. And, there's no end in sight for that 10% tariff. When you hear that, the 125% tariff in China is off, oh, we all feel a sense of relief. But given what happened in the first Trump administration, the tariffs then, the Biden kept and increased on, and the new tariffs, we're talking about an effective tax rate of 50%. That's a huge tariff. The sectoral tariffs on autos and metals are there, and there is, in the pipeline, talk about tariffs or pharmaceuticals for semiconductors. So, I look at my retirement account, and I'm glad that the market is not telling me I should not be working another 30 years. But I feel that maybe we are a little too hopeful that there will be some economic rationality that sets in. But the thing is that maybe he will back away and come back. And he doesn't come back to 0.0. There's already a lot of tariff there. And the uncertainty is eternal.
What's interesting to that is, that if you actually look empirically, right, and the data from Japan, for example, right, you see that pricing, contracted prices, right, in the car industry, and we only have the month of May data out, right, have collapsed by more than 20%. So there's actually a scarier argument, right, which is that this actually works. It's not the American consumer to the full extent, but to a very, very small extent, who's going to pay for it. And it's actually going to come out of corporate earnings. And certainly in the Japanese case, there's enough of a buffer, right, to actually absorb that. Specifically, why the market is up, I think it has at the moment actually very little to do with tariffs. It has everything to do with the hope that the Federal Reserve is going to be forced into cutting interest rates, right? So that's a slightly different dynamic that compounds on the whole thing, But there's this scenario, and I wanted to ask you from my final question was going to be, is like, what if this actually works? In the sense of that the American economy muddles through. It's not going to have a great takeoff, but there's not going to be this inflationary threat. Real wages, real incomes in America continue to grow very nicely, thank you. They are all jumping up and down because for the first time in the history of America, America had a budget surplus, in April because of tariff revenue collection. Now, it's very seasonal. It's just one data point. I'm not supporting the policy, intellectually. But I mean, this in the real world, the what if of this actually working, right? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that, there are other people who have made the argument that tariffs work. And even those analysts and scholars are not operating with a scenario of this whirlwind changing of the tariffs night and day.
Yep.
Because that's a different way of doing this. You could still be saying, well, we need to go back to, higher level of tariffs. We need to rebalance these relationships. We believe that by doing that, we'll force others to. The question of the day is who eats the tariffs, and the Trump administration is saying it's going to be others. It's not going to be us. And what we're going to do, and President Trump always talks about this, just come produce everything in the United States, and then you'll be tariff-free. But I think that the president in this case is his worst enemy, if I may say so, because he doesn't stick to the plan. If you had some consistency and you say, well, this is a tariff and this is I think that it's also a very real estate view of how you do things. For him, tariffs are like an entrance fee ticket. So you pay the tariff, you're in. But then he needs to stick to the price, because when he doesn't, then that's when you see the loss in consumer confidence, the loss in investor certainty about what they'll do, how they'll handle the tariffs. Because you mentioned the situation with the contract prices, but there's also journalistic and anecdotal evidence saying that some Japanese car companies thought, well, maybe we can eat the tariff for a little while, but we cannot do this forever, and we may raise the prices. And the metal prices have already gone up. And to me, it's not just about what's been done in the tariff or trade world when we think about what if it pays and the U.S. economy does great. It's the fact that we're going to go through a huge shock because of the immigration situation. And, you have now this campaign of mass deportation, and also what we're doing to science the collapse in investments in science, and then the budget deficit. I mean, for tax revenue to really be able to complement for that, first of all, the tariffs cannot be that high that you end up discouraging trade. And whether you have that fine-tuning ability, I don't see President Trump, who gets angry with Lula and says 50% tariff, to be able to deliver me that outcome.
In the interest of time, can we maybe have 3 questions? And are you comfortable with that? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Matt from the British Embassy, Councillor for Trade Policy. I wanted to ask you about, and maybe this is an unfair question, but the long-term consensus on trade policy in the United States following President Trump. I know it's hard to predict even what will happen tomorrow, but you know, the political pendulum swings, and when Japan and other countries are thinking strategically about what the United States and its trade policy will be in 5 years, 10 years' time, what should it be thinking about so that it doesn't close its strategic space, for example, for a future US administration to consider joining CPTPP, or for a future US administration to re-engage with the multilateral system, or even if, you know, on issues like LNG, if a future Democratic administration takes a different view on the things that President Trump is asking for, you know, what are the sorts of things which are here to stay with Trump's trade policy, and what are the things that might change when countries consider their strategic negotiation positions?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great question. I'm Hendrik Kordanger, founding member here at Asia Society. My question is, what do you see happening with the trade relationships of South Asia and Southeast Asia? There's an opportunity for Japan to draw closer there and to have kind of a world of trade throughout Asia that is a little bit insulated from the US issue. At the same time, those countries are drawn very much to China. They're also not terribly unified. Do you see any way forward on Asia, South Asia, and how that trade relationship is going to develop?
Yep. Andreas.
Just quickly, I think in the face of adversity, it's always good to look at, so what are my strengths? And one of the strengths that I see in Japan, it's gaman ability, right? This endurance, and which I think is way higher than U.S. Electing population is. And in the face of that, then at the same time looking, why not Japan, Canada, Mexico and Europe coming together? Why is there not a bigger movement to bring the people leave China? I think they will then very happily fall in line and be part of it, and then have a separate one together, Japan and China being, of course, holding a massive amount of US debt. Just talking about it, I think, would just totally upset markets, to your point, that would be a great regulant, as markets are with Trump. That's the only thing he listens to.
Yep.
Thank you for the great questions. I'll try to address them efficiently. I think that the key word in your question was consensus. Then you said U.S. consensus in the U.S. is like, that's a really tough one, because obviously that's the challenge of living in a very polarized country. What could be long-term trends in U.S. trade policy? I think that's a great question. And I am not sure I can give you the answer right away, because what I see now is that, yes, for the past 10, 15 years, we know that the U.S. support in the U.S. political circles for trade liberalization has diminished dramatically. And that's why the TPP was an orphan in the 2016 election, and nobody is thinking about picking up that mantle. We're now going to be, I think, schooled and learned in a hard way, I think, that the cost of tariffs. And where that begins to change public views about tariffs, I think, to me, is one of the interesting things to watch in the next 5, 10 years. In the past few months, I never seen people sort of go out in the street and demonstrate against tariffs. And I'm beginning to see that. Now, that, sporadic incidents don't make for a transformation. And it goes, I think, to Jesper's point. What if it proves that the U.S. can deliver prosperity through the use of tariff in a Hamiltonian way? Maybe that becomes ingrained in the political system. But I think that we're not going to have that disciplined approach to tariffs. Not that I believe that they really deliver the best outcome anyway, but I think that we might be schooled in the costs of the tariffs, particularly because they are very hard on the people at the lower rung of the income ladder. So they're very regressive. And we also are seeing a lot of cuts to the safety net as part of the recent budget bill. So how these issues play out in the political process is everyone's guess. But that would be one debate I think that would be worth watching. Now, what I think might be more long-term and lasting, instead of thinking about these punitive tariffs, we also punish the consumer. And the U.S. has been a very consumer-oriented society. So we're all sort of, we're going to see when the Amazon bill is this much, or we're going to the groceries this much, we're going to see how that changes public views on trade or not. But what I do think is that perhaps when it comes to the economic statecraft or the technology competition with the with China, those I think are there are areas where there's more bipartisan consensus, if I may venture to use the word. So that those may be longer term. Now, how President Trump deals with China is a dynamic I didn't have a chance to address, is that I don't think President Trump himself is a China hawk. So I think he's prepared to cut a deal with Xi that may be short-lived, but that he would be very willing to come and bring all the executives and talk about investment deals and all of that. And later, in a month or so, feel that you cheated on me, and then we go back to. But in general, I do believe that the terms of economic competition are very much fixed because of the structural realities of the current geopolitical moment. On Southeast Asia, I think that's a huge area of opportunity for Japan. I do believe that the Japanese government and the Japanese business community is very fixed on sustaining what has been, I think, a very profound, deep economic relationship. And there, of course, the competition is with China, who also has a very strong hand, and in electric vehicles and in other areas. Chinese products are very, very competitive. My sense from conversations from sometimes we have Brookings visitors from Southeast Asia is that they don't want to, they always say, don't make us choose the US, but they also don't want to choose just China, right? They would like Japan to be that important counterweight economically and in security terms. So I think that Tokyo has a lot that it can do there. There was a comment at a conference when I first arrived in Tokyo, Prime Minister Shiba gave some remarks, and what was interesting to me is that he said, we're going to launch CTPP dialogues with the EU and ASEAN, or ASEAN members. Where does this take you? I don't know. I know that Indonesia is now thinking more about CPTPP. I don't think they're ready for it, but I think that that gives you a ramp to work towards, deeper economic cooperation. And the question was about Gaman Suru, and why don't they work with other partners? Well, I agree with the sentiment of the question, and that's why I'm pushing for, and Canada and Mexico are already part of the CPTPP and the UK. In general, I think the risk is because Trump is pursuing bilateral negotiations, that he picks them apart, right? And that they don't coalesce to negotiate. I don't think there's appetite here to retaliate, but maybe a coordinated approach to negotiate something. But it's hard. Let me tell you a little bit about the U.S., about the Canada-Mexico relations, because there you have a long-standing 30 years of North American economic integration, and it happened in the first Trump administration. We're seeing in the second Trump administration, they both under really existential attack on the terms of dismantling a lot of what has brought that economic bloc together, and Canada and Mexico are not really coordinating with each other in the response to the Trump administration. They're each trying to reach the best terms they can vis-a-vis individually with the Trump administration. And this, I think, has its genesis in the fact that I've always looked at NAFTA, now USMCA, as two bilaterals more than an in-depth trilateral. So that's another thing about this bilateral approach, that it sort of creates incentives for countries to think if we go first, we'll get a better deal. Or if Trump has a problem with immigration, that's a Mexico issue, or things like this. So that's a peril, I think, that should be avoided.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now you see that there's light and sunshine just about to come through, which must be because of you. Look, we live in an incredibly simple world, in the sense of that, Mr. Trump is the dictator and everything starts and ends there. And you may or may not like that, but we unfortunately do have to deal with the reality that might is right and they are exercising their power. How you, cross that bridge, whether it's on a bilateral basis, whether it's on a multilateral basis, obviously building alliances, is going to be a huge challenge, giving the ability to fragment, to divide and rule. But I think for all of us, for you as individuals, for your companies, for Asia society, I think as the confrontational negotiations on the trade side intensify, I think it behooves us to strengthen the civil society interactions. Because yes, it's hard, but the relationship between particularly Japan and the United States is a very, very deep, broad and dense one. And yes, it's confrontational right now. Yes, Japan is recognizing that it's not special. It's just one of them in many different ways. But on the other hand, you do have deep connections, right, in civil society. And I think all of us should make an even greater effort to actually intensify, these efforts so that at least the foundation, right, continues to actually get stronger. Why, even though if the economics may get a little bit harder. It's been fascinating.